We're going to be in Matthew chapter 24. We're starting a new section, the second section, Matthew 24 verses 15 through 35. But we're going to do a couple sermons. This will be part one. I'd encourage you, if you don't have a handout, that you run back on the back table there and grab yourself one, because I'm going to give you some notes. And if you like the way the New Testament ties in with the Old Testament, if you like the way we understand something from the New Testament because it was already told to us in the Old Testament, I would highly encourage you to take some notes on this, because we're going to see two especially significant things that get clarified. And boy, it's just almost one verse of Scripture that makes all the difference of the world. And if a person overlooks the verse or doesn't know it's there, you can draw the wrong conclusions. And I'm going to try to tie those things together for you today. So mostly, I'm going to give you some background information. This concept where Jesus keeps saying the Son of Man coming on the clouds. That's the title of the sermon, except you notice I titled it The Son of Man Going on the Clouds, and there's a reason for that. Let me just give you the sermon topics. There'll be two of them that I would watch for if I was you. The first one is, how was God's promise to David modified? God promised David, one of your sons will sit on your throne in your kingdom forever and ever. But that promise got modified later on in the Old Testament, and most people, even Protestants today, have missed the modification. And there are people that are still waiting for David's son to sit on David's throne in David's kingdom over in Jerusalem. So today is going to clarify that. How was David's promise, God's promise to David, modified? Number two, how is the coming on the clouds? You'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. How is that a poor and even misleading translation? That's what we're going to focus on. So let's talk about this idea of kingdom. We see it in the New Testament a lot. Kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven. Both John the Baptist and Jesus both said, hey, go tell people that the kingdom of heaven is near. But do you feel like you have a good grasp on this concept, this kingdom of heaven? What exactly does that mean? How does it come near? Is it nearer today than it was then? What is this concept of this kingdom in heaven? Well, I'd like to work on that today. So let's start with the basic fundamental concept of a kingdom. It's strange to us because we don't call them kingdoms anymore. We call them nations. But back then, what we call a kingdom today, back then would have been called a nation. And so fundamentally, what you need to have is a piece of land, which is called the kingdom. That land's going to have boundaries because there'll be another kingdom next to it. In that kingdom, there's going to be a capital somewhere. And in that capital, there's going to be a king that is ruling that kingdom, that nation, from that capital. That's the fundamental concept. An antiquated concept. Today, if I was to try to give you the same idea, I would say that the kingdom is a nation, like the nation of the United States. That nation, that kingdom has a capital, Washington, D.C. And the capital is where the king rules from, or what we don't call them kings today because we don't have a monarchy anymore. We call our leader in the capital a president. So a nation, a capital, and a president. That's the fundamental concept. It would be valuable to us, though. Let's go back in their day. In their day, the Bible readers, the fundamental idea of this kingdom was all of Israel, all of Palestine all of the promised land. That was the kingdom. But they lost that because of the rebelliousness of the kings, starting with King Solomon. And all of Palestine was divided into two. You got two tribes in the south. I believe it was Judah and Benjamin, if I remember correctly. I might be wrong. And then the other 10 tribes up in the north. Those 10 tribes in the north, their capital was Samaria, and their king was Jeroboam to begin with. That was the break. And then in the south, you had the 2 tribes. The capital down there was Jerusalem, and there was various kings that ruled from Jerusalem, but the ideal king was always King David. That's our most basic Bible study. And the most basic Bible study was King David was the best king. He was a good king. He had a kingdom, and his capital that he ruled from was Jerusalem. Physical places, tangible places, concrete aspects of a king, a kingdom, and a capital. If we follow the Bible story of David, we know that God loved David so much and was so pleased with David, a man after God's own heart, that God makes David a promise. And God promises King David, I promise you that one of your sons will rule over your kingdom. But there's a strange word here, forever. Your son, David, or one of your sons, is going to rule over your kingdom forever. And that was the major Old Testament promise. And all of everything that Jerusalem and Judea and Palestine goes through, all of the hardships, all of the exiles, all of the destruction and desolation that Jerusalem experiences over the ages, and they're still waiting for the promise that David's son would rule from Jerusalem, because it was supposed to be an eternal promise. And one of the questions we want to find out today is, how did that promise get modified? First, let me read you the promise so that we're familiar with it. It was already obvious after the exiles had come back from Babylon and were trying to rebuild Jerusalem. It had been destroyed, set on fire, the walls broke down, the temple destroyed. All the Jews come back from exile, and they're expecting God to keep His promise. A new Jerusalem, a new temple, a new king that would last forever. But notice that they are already recognizing, hey God, what happened? No Jerusalem, no temple, and no king. And Israel becomes aware that the promise is not being fulfilled. Let me take you to Psalm chapter 89, and I want to show you that. Psalm chapter 89 is a very valuable psalm because the whole chapter, verses 1 through 37, I would make a note of this. Psalm 89, if this is the only psalm you get familiar with. Psalm 89 is divided into 2 parts. Verses 1 through 37 is the psalmist is recounting the promises that God made to David, your son, your kingdom, your capital, forever. But then in verse 38 through the end of the chapter, the psalmist changes his tone. Says, God, what happened? We're destroyed, and you haven't kept your promise. Let me read that to you. Psalm 89, verse 34. First, he's recounting the promises to David. I will not violate my covenant or alter the word that went forth from my lips. Once and for all, I have sworn by my holiness that I will not lie to David. His offspring shall endure forever, and his throne as long as the sun is before me. The psalmist finishes off by recounting God's promise. And then listen to the tone change in just verse 38. But now you have cast us off and rejected us. You are full of wrath against your anointed, and you have renounced the covenant that you made with your servant. You have defiled his crown in the dust. We're destroyed. There's nothing left of Jerusalem. God, what have you done? I would like to give you the rest of that story, and it is a pivotal importance that we grasp the magnitude and the concept of the change that happened. In order to highlight how this change happened to you, I want to compare 2 Samuel chapter 7 with 1 Chronicles chapter 17. That's going to be the next section on your handout. First, let me explain what the Chronicles is. 1 and 2 Chronicles, if you've ever read it, you probably quit reading it and skipped it, because 1 and 2 Chronicles sounds exactly like 1 and 2 Kings. He says all the exact same stuff. It's like a bunch of quotations, not only from 1 and 2 Kings, but also from 1 and 2 Samuel. Let me tell you the difference of what 1 and 2 Chronicles is about. 1 and 2 Chronicles was written after the return from the exiles. And the purpose for writing 1 and 2 Chronicles is to retell Israel's story, which is already written down in 1 and 2 Kings and 1 and 2 Samuel. But the purpose is, now that we've been destroyed, now that we've come back from exile, now that it feels like God hasn't kept those promises, he writes 1 and 2 Chronicles by restating the best parts of 1 and 2 Kings and 1 and 2 Samuel, and sometimes he even reinterprets what was said in those other books in order to encourage Israel to be faithful to God, to rise up and to be righteous and to be holy, even though it looks like God hasn't kept his promises. So Chronicles is a book of encouragement, and even a book that reinterprets the things that were said earlier. You will enjoy Chronicles more if you know that, and look for it as a book that was written by a preacher that was trying to encourage people who were discouraged by what looks like failed promises. I want to show you a unique portion of this where the chronicler quotes a section of Scripture. He actually quotes the promise to David that we already read in the Psalm. He's going to quote the promises to David to remind them that it's true, but notice when he quotes them, typically when we quote somebody, we want to quote the Bible exactly the way the quote went, right? We don't want to change stuff. But I want to point out to you that the chronicler does change what was already said before. So I'm going to walk through both Chronicles and Samuel, and I'm going to walk them through the text, and I want to compare the text to show you that it's a direct quotation, but at the very end, he changes something. So let's look at it. We'll start. We're going to compare 1 Chronicles 17 with 2 Samuel 7, and they line up. 2 Samuel 7:11 lines up with 1 Chronicles 17:10. And this should be pretty much an exact quote. So, let's look at them. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. Talking to King David, that's the promise. But here's the redaction in 1 Chronicles, "Moreover, I declare to you that the Lord will build you a house." Pretty much an exact quote. Moving on to verses 12 and 13 in Samuel, "I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body. I'll establish his kingdom, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." That was the original promise to David. The chronicler should quote that about the same. "I will raise up your offspring after you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom, and I will establish his throne forever." Pretty much exactly the same. If we keep walking through, verse 16 in Samuel and verse 14 in Chronicles. Verse 16, "Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever." That was the reassurance to King David. "King David, I'm going to give your son your house and your kingdom, and he will rule it forever." But when the preacher quotes that verse, I want you to notice the change that he makes 700 years later. Verse 14 there in Chronicles, "But I will confirm him in my house and in my kingdom forever." I am so grateful that we live in a time where we have so much material that helps us understand the Scriptures. We could very likely read over this and never make the connection, never see the redaction, never notice that 700 years after Samuel is written, the chronicler writes the Chronicles, requotes Samuel, but updates, modifies the promise that had been made. In light of new circumstances, here's the difference. In Samuel, the promise is, "David, I'm going to raise up one of your sons to rule your kingdom and your house forever." But it's obvious that David's kingdom no longer exists. David's house no longer exists. Everything has been destroyed. What happened, God? Why didn't you keep your promise? And now the new promise is, no, it's going to be a little bit different. I am going to keep my promise to your son, David, but now your son is going to be ruling over my house and my kingdom forever. The difference here is that David's house was Israel. David's kingdom was Israel, Palestine. David's capital was Jerusalem. That's not the plan anymore. The plan now is, David, one of your sons, I will raise him up and he's going to rule over my kingdom, the whole earth. And David, this son of yours, is going to rule from my capital, which is heaven. That's the new plan. It's no longer Jerusalem and that capital. It's now the whole world. And the capital is now heaven. In the Scriptures, sometimes we read this idea of a heavenly Jerusalem. We ought to not be picturing, so there's a Jerusalem in heaven also? No. The idea of Jerusalem is that's the capital. God has moved the capital of the kingdom from earthly Jerusalem to a heavenly Jerusalem. The capital of the world is now heaven. It's no longer an earthly place. And I'm going to raise up David's son to rule over the world from heaven. That's what this verse confirms. That's the change. That's the modification. And I think most of the Protestant world has missed this fact. Because the Protestant world is still focused on the earthly Jerusalem, still focused on a king coming back to rule from Jerusalem. So where do we find out about this happening? Now that we know that a change was made, and not many people have picked up on this change. We've got to make a mental shift from Jerusalem being the capital of Israel to heaven being the capital of God's kingdom, the entire world. This is one of the reasons why Jesus was able to tell the Samaritan woman. Samaritan woman was asking Jesus, where's the capital? Where is the main place that we go worship God from? Samaritan woman asked Jesus, our fathers worship here in Samaria from this capital on this mountain. But your people worship from that capital, Jerusalem, in that temple, that earthly place. So where should we worship? Where is the true capital? Is it up here in Samaria where our fathers worship? Or is it down there in Jerusalem where your people worship? And Jesus' answer is, I tell you the truth, a time is coming when you're not going to worship from Samaria and you're not going to be worshiping from Jerusalem. You're going to be worshiping God in spirit and truth because the capital has been moved to heaven. And now the whole world can worship from wherever they are because they're all underneath that new heavenly capital. So now I want to take you with that idea. I'd like to take you to Daniel chapters 2 through 7, and this will be the next part of your handout. Daniel chapter 2 through 7 is where we see how is God going to get one of David's son to rule from heaven. It might have been fascinating for you to put yourself back in their time and to ask yourself, I want you to understand, one of David's sons, in those days, any of your grandchildren were considered a son of that patriarch. So David, David's son, David's grandson, David's great-great-great-grandchildren are all considered sons of David. So somewhere down your genealogical line, David, somewhere down that line, eventually someone is going to be born from your line, David. And he's going to sit on a throne in heaven and rule the whole world, David. That's the new promise. How does that possibly happen? Daniel gives us the image. Let me read you this quote about Daniel chapter 2 through 7. Very unique section of the Bible. It was even written in a different language. It was written in Aramaic instead of Hebrew, so that all the people could understand chapters 2 through 7. Very unique section. Here's a quote about it. Few studies have done on this subsection of Daniel, chapters 2 through 7, and none has uncovered what I consider to be the most striking point. That this important section of Daniel provides the most extensive and elaborate development of the heaven, earth, kingdom themes found anywhere in Jewish literature. The nature of Daniel 2 through 7 is recognizing something beyond what we can see in the world. Recognize something transcendent. Everybody acknowledges that we have a nation, United States. Everybody can see that we have a capital, that fancy white building over in D.C., and everyone can see that we have a king or a president. We watch him on TV. Those are the things that are obvious. Those are the things that we recognize. Those are the things that people submit to. But the purpose of Daniel is to say it doesn't stop there. The purpose of Daniel is to say, but there is an ultimate king. There is an ultimate president. And really, he is the one that's in charge. He is the one that our president must submit himself to. He is the one that earthly kings and kingdoms must submit themselves to. There is no ultimate authority on earth because the ultimate authority is in heaven. And every authority on earth better be submitting himself or herself to that transcendent heavenly authority. What happens when that does not happen? And that's the purpose of Daniel chapter 2 through 7. Let me walk you through little pieces of it. There is a heavenly kingdom that rules over the earthly kingdoms. And there is a heavenly king that rules over earthly kings, and you earthly kings better recognize this and submit yourself to his authority. Here's the story. Let me start in Daniel chapter 4, and this is the purpose, to remind all of our earthly kings who really is in charge. Daniel chapter 4 and verse 32. The God of heaven is speaking through Daniel to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. Babylon was the capital, but at that time, Babylon was a world empire. So the whole world was being controlled by Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is the king. He thinks he's in charge of the whole world. God shows up to let him know that that's not exactly how it works. Let's start out in verse 32. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you will be made to eat grass like an ox. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will. Let me go back here and grab my little water bottle, guys. Basically, what God tells Daniel to go to that dude that thinks he's in charge of the world, and I want you to let him know that I'm going to make him crazy. I'm going to make him insane. I'm going to make him eat grass like an ox until he recognizes that I'm the one in charge here, not him. And sometimes I look at our government and I can't help but feel that maybe that's happening again. I'm going to make people insane if you think you're the bosses. And I'm going to ruin everything you try to do until you recognize that I am the one in charge here. You do not get to exalt LGBTQ pride days. You do not get to exalt pro-choice and abortion. You guys don't get to decide that kind of stuff, is what the heavenly king is telling the earthly kings. You don't get to decide those kinds of things. And if you exalt those things and that's what you're promoting, I'll make sure that you eat grass like an ox until you recognize who is truly in charge here. Let's go back to our verse 34. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to the heavens, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and I honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will. Verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the true King of heaven. Because all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. What a powerful, valuable scripture for us to be holding on to even in our age. God says, I will rule from heaven. And if anybody wants to say differently, I will humble people that walk in pride and in arrogance. So the next time you see a pride flag walking down the street, God has already said what he's going to do with people who are proud and arrogant. That's one example of God reminding earthly kings who's really in charge. Let me take you to another one in the book of Daniel. We're going to go to Daniel chapter 6. This time, Daniel is speaking to Darius. A new king has risen up. And Darius decides he's in charge, he's the boss, and his helpers get him to make a new law. Hey, Darius, why don't you say, I notice there's these guys over here praising this foreign god. Who knows what that is? You know how those zealots are over there. He's praising a different god. So, Darius, why don't you make a rule that says for 30 days you can praise no other god except for me, Darius. You don't get to worship your God the way you want to. You don't get to say Christ is king if you want to. For 30 days, you don't get to do that. You only praise the emperor. So he makes that decree, and there are people, Daniel in particular, that work in Darius's government. They're a citizen of that government. He has no choice because he's in exile. He's living in a place he doesn't want to be, but he can't go to the place he wants to be yet. So he's participating in this foreign government. And he says, yeah, I'll go along and I'll keep the peace, but I will not cross the line. I will not do what this government tells me to do if it is different than what the true heavenly government is telling me what to do. So I'm going to go ahead and pray in public. Daniel says, I'm going to go ahead and say Christ is king in public and let the chips fall where they may. So what does he do? Throws them into the lion's den. God shows up, the lions don't eat him, and now look at what Darius says. Because a member of this earthly kingdom actually acted as though they were members of a transcendent kingdom. He was acting as though he was actually a member of a much greater kingdom, and nothing was going to make him compromise his citizenship in that greater kingdom above. So look at what happens. Daniel chapter 6 and verse 26. I make a decree that all in my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Because he is the living God, enduring forever. Because his kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be till the end. That is an everlasting dominion. He is an everlasting king, and he rules from that heavenly capital, and everybody better recognize this. Oh, I long for the days, and we should pray for the days where our own president will stand at a microphone and say exactly what Darius said. Transcendent epithets. He is saying things about God that do not apply to any earthly king. Let me read you a quote on this. How does the God of heaven rule in light of the apparent superior power of the oppressive earthly kings? Daniel chapter 2 through 7. offers the consoling answer that God the King does indeed rule in heaven. From there will protect those who trust in Him. He is the one who has placed earthly rulers in their places and can easily dispose of them as He did Nebuchadnezzar. All right, so we've been set up for the understanding of this God's kingdom transcending all the kingdoms of the earth. Now I want to bring you back to what the chronicler, how the chronicler modified the promises to David. I will keep my promise to one of your sons, David, but now he's not going to rule your kingdom, Israel, from your capital, Jerusalem. Now the promise is he's going to rule my kingdom, the entire world, from my capital, heaven. I want to show you Daniel chapter 7, the Son of Man going on the clouds in Daniel chapter 7 is where we see that, how that happens. How does a man get from earth up to God's throne? And David gets a vision of how that's going to happen. He gets multiple visions. This is called a recapitulation. When something gets repeated over and over, it gets said in Daniel chapter 2 first. I'm just going to kind of summarize it. In Daniel chapter 2, Daniel sees a statue. 4 different parts to the statue represents 4 different kingdoms. This rock comes, hits those kingdoms, destroys them, and the rock becomes a mountain, takes over the whole earth. That is one apocalyptic image of someone who comes to the earth, conquers all the earthly kingdoms, and fills the whole earth with His kingdom. But let me read to you this Son of Man, and the reason we're doing this is because when we look at Matthew next week, when we return to Matthew, he's going to talk about the prophecies of Daniel, and Jesus is going to see, you're going to see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. So we're going to dedicate ourselves to understanding that, our second sermon theme, the Son of Man coming on the clouds. How is that a poor or misleading translation? And it comes from Daniel 7. So let me read this to you. Daniel sees a vision. Daniel 7, beginning in verse 13. And I saw in the night visions, behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. It's actually literally like a human person. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. And his dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away. Daniel, when Daniel is living in exile, Daniel witnessed Babylon coming in, destroying Jerusalem, destroying the temple. Daniel was taken. So Daniel is living over in Babylon, and he feels the same way the psalmist felt. God, what happened? You made a promise. Where is our king? Where is our capital? Where is our kingdom? Everything is destroyed. Where is the fulfillment of your promise? So God shows him a vision. God shows him someone who looks like a man, rides the clouds, and goes to the Ancient of Days and sits on his throne and rules from heaven. Can you imagine? We kind of get that. Maybe some of you kind of recognize, I see what's happening here. But can you imagine what that must have been like for Daniel? How does a guy get to heaven and rule from heaven? I'm fascinated by that. Daniel didn't understand it, didn't get it. Now there's something important that's happening in this verse that I think is misleading. And so I want to walk you through this and pay attention, because this is going to change a lot of what we call eschatology. What many people today are waiting for. And it's going to show why this is not something we're waiting for, why this is something that already happened. And it's because of the way the verse is misleading. Let me walk you back through this part. Look specifically at Daniel 7, verse 13. Daniel sees something. And I saw in the night visions, behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. I want you to stop for a minute. What is the I gave you guys a fancy word a few weeks ago. Schema. What is the schema? Schema means what visions pop into your head when you hear a certain word. That's a great definition, and it's valuable. When we hear the Bible say something, certain images pop into our head. Sometimes we need to challenge those images when we learn something new in the Bible, and we have to go, oh, what I thought that meant, I was wrong. So this is going to challenge your schema. This is the text where the New Testament is quoting when it says, and you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. We all have a schema. We all think we know what that means. What do you think that means? Great, I'm going to see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. We all probably assume the same thing. Because in English, the word coming always means from there to me. Think about that. If I hear a Bible verse that says, and I'm going to see him coming on the clouds, English means, okay, I'm going to see him on a cloud coming to me. We're going to challenge that today, because let's look at our verse and let's look at what this strange word that's been translated coming. Remember, they've translated this from a Greek word, and they chose to translate erchomai, the Greek word erchomai. They chose to translate that word as coming. And I want to suggest that that's misleading. Let me show you why. Let's read the next verse, verse 13, Daniel 7:13. And he came to where Daniel was? No. He came to the Ancient of Days. The person who looked like a man came on a cloud to the Ancient of Days. Does that sound a little bit confusing to you? And this is the reason why. Erchomai, which the translators of the New Testament, the people that have translated things into English, have always presupposed, assumed that this was Jesus coming to earth on a cloud. But when you look at the text, be careful to look at the text, verse 13, Jesus is not coming to earth on a cloud. Jesus is going from earth to God in heaven on a cloud. Do you see that picture clearly? Because I don't want you to be afraid that this guy is teaching a heresy, because all of us have always understood. So what the part that I need to share with you is erchomai in the Greek means coming or going. And unfortunately, the translator should have said, I saw Jesus going on a cloud to heaven. Because erchomai means coming or going, either direction. But unfortunately, if you translate that into English as coming, well, that's only one direction in English, and it's misleading. That is a profound insight, you guys. The text should read for clarification purposes. Daniel saw someone like a man going from earth on a cloud to heaven. So from now on, whenever we see the quote from Daniel, and I saw the Son of Man coming on the cloud, you are going to have to restrain yourself and retrain yourself and remind yourself coming is not a good translation. What Daniel saw was Jesus going to God on a cloud, not coming on a cloud. So now we can understand the fulfillment of 1 Chronicles chapter 17. Earlier, when the chronicler changed the quote from your son, your kingdom, your house, your capital, David, the new understanding is, I will raise up one of your sons to rule from my kingdom, my house, my capital. And the way it gets accomplished, he changes that. 1 Chronicles 17:14, I'll confer him in my house, in my kingdom forever, and his throne will be established forever. The way God accomplishes that is by his own incarnation into flesh through Mary and Joseph, descendants of David. Their offspring is God incarnate, God in the flesh. Through his death and resurrection, death could not have victory over him, but he had victory over death. That was the major victory. And after that, he rose up to heaven, seated at the right hand of God the Father, where he now rules over God's kingdom from God's capital. That is what Daniel saw, and that is what the chronicler recorded for us. Well, that's our background information to you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Actually, you will see the Son of Man going on the cloud of heaven. Now, let's put a pause right there. This means we now have a Son of David, Jesus himself, who sits in heaven ruling over the entire world, and the entire world better understand. All the presidents and kings and tyrants of the world better understand that he is the one that is ruling, and they had better submit themselves to him, or he will come and make their house desolate. He will come and ruin the plans of their heart until you recognize Christ is King. We're going to put a pin in the sermon right there, but I want to offer you guys a scripture in Hebrews. If you'll turn to Hebrews chapter 2. And you might be willing to admit, okay, Tony, I see what you're saying. I quoted all the scriptures, so I see it. But, Tony, it doesn't look like it. It sure doesn't look like Jesus is ruling from heaven, because our world is in absolute chaos. Just like the psalmist, God, where's the promises? Everything still looks messed up. And I want to offer you a verse of comfort if you ever feel like that. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 7. You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You've crowned him with glory and honor. and you have put everything in subjection under His feet. Now, in putting everything in subjection to Him, He left nothing outside of His control. But at the present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to Him. Verse 9, but we see Him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of His death, so that by the grace of God He might taste death for everyone. He says He has been given all authority. He has been given all dominion. He is ruling from heaven. God has left nothing outside of His control. For some reason, it just doesn't look like it yet. But it is coming, brothers and sisters. It is coming. And we read from other passages the reason God is being patient, because He wants everybody to be saved. When Christ comes to show His dominion over the kingdoms of the earth, it's going to be too late. And all the people that refuse to accept that transcendent King of heaven will be destroyed and will be kicked out of God's kingdom. And one day the kingdoms of the earth will become the kingdoms of God. And He will kick out everything horrible that ruins the kingdom. So the reason it doesn't look like it yet is because God is being patient, not wanting anyone to be lost, wanting the gospel to go out so that the whole world would embrace the true King of the world and not be misled by an earthly king, an earthly government, an earthly power. One day God will come and take over the world for Himself. But then it will be too late for everybody.